The night settles gently around you, and in this quiet space, we begin a slow descent into a story that has drifted across centuries. Before rushing into history or myth, allow the mind to soften, as if dusting off the world outside and placing it at a comfortable distance. With every breath, imagine yourself stepping into a calm corridor of time, one where the noises of the present fade into something soft and distant. Here, the story of El Dorado begins not with gold or conquest, but with silence, with the stillness that comes before memory, as though the world itself is inhaling before speaking. In the long sweep of human history, myths rarely appear suddenly. They rise gradually, like mist over quiet water, forming shape only when someone looks closely enough to give them meaning. The myth of El Dorado is one such mist, a shimmering presence that hovered over the early imagination of explorers, merchants, priests, and storytellers. Yet before it became a legend of unimaginable gold or a lost city hidden deep within jungles, it lived only as a faint idea, an echo traveling between worlds that barely understood one another. So as the mind rests, imagine distant landscapes softened by dusk. Imagine mountain peaks covered in gentle clouds, valleys where wind moves slowly through tall grasses, and lakes so still that the moon seems to pause upon their surface. This is where our journey truly begins, not in the clash between cultures, but in the quiet breath of nature itself. It is in this peaceful setting that ancient rituals once unfolded, rituals that would one day be transformed into the idea of El Dorado. But for now, the story remains unhurried, patient, and suspended in the soft space between truth and dreams. Let your imagination drift to a time long before European ships appear along the northern shores of South America, long before maps were filled with speculative kingdoms or rumors of golden men. In these early eras, the indigenous peoples of the Andes lived in harmony with the rhythm of the land. Their stories were not written on paper or carved into stone. They lived in the patterns of seasons, in the movement of stars, in the quiet offering of gratitude to the lakes, mountains, and spirits around them. To them, gold was not a measure of wealth or power. It was a reflection of the sun, a sacred material that symbolized warmth, vitality, and divine presence. As you breathe slowly, imagine a solitary figure standing at the edge of a calm lake. The light touches the surface just enough to create faint ripples of gold. There is no urgency here, no rush to extract treasure or seek riches. Instead, there is only reverence. It is within this peaceful, almost meditative way of life that the seed of the El Dorado legend was planted, though neither the people performing their rituals nor the land that held them could have known how far the story would travel. When later visitors arrived from distant continents, the world they encountered was unfamiliar, layered with symbols they could not interpret. A ceremony meant to honor gods was perceived as a glittering display of wealth. A sacred lake became, in the minds of onlookers, a vault filled with hidden riches. And in a time when empires across the ocean were hungry for resources, these misinterpretations began to take root, transforming slowly into the legend of a golden land. But at this early stage of the story, everything remains soft, quiet, and undefined. Tonight, as you listen, allow yourself to sink into the gentle tempo of this unfolding tale. There is no need to grasp anything tightly, no need to chase the meaning. Just drift with it. Imagine ancient mountains resting beneath starlit skies. Imagine forests waking and sleeping with the breeze. Imagine rivers moving with patient certainty. These landscapes existed long before words shaped them into stories. They existed long before treasure hunters marched across them in search of glory. And in the stillness of these places, myths gather like dew, quiet, glistening, and easily misunderstood. It is often said that myths are born from a single moment, but more often they grow from countless small misunderstandings and hopes layered on top of one another. A ritual performed at dawn, a traveler who interprets what he sees through his own desires, a storyteller who adds a little wonder to a tale before passing onward. And so the myth drifts and expands, shaped gently by every mind that touches it. As we begin this long journey through history and imagination, picture the world as it once was, vast, open, and unhurried. Europe, restless and filled with ambition, was looking outward for answers. The Americas, rich with diverse cultures, held stories crafted not from gold but from meaning. These worlds were destined to meet, but at this moment in our story, they remain separate like two distant shores with only the quiet sea between them. Allow the body to rest a little deeper now, as the myth of El Dorado settles softly around you. It is a story of longing, of dreams both misguided and magnificent, of landscapes that shape hope and disappointment in equal measure. But for now, we stay in this gentle beginning, letting the legend take its first slow breath. As the night deepens, imagine the faint glow of a torch reflected on water, the gentle murmur of voices speaking in a language shaped by mountains and sky. Imagine the stillness of a world untouched by maps, untouched by conquest, untouched by the heavy footsteps of explorers. This is where the dream begins, in silence, in ritual, and in a truth that is far calmer, far more spiritual than the myth it would eventually become. Here, in this moment of quiet reflection, we prepare to follow the story forward, gently and without urgency, into the birth of a legend that would travel far beyond the mountains where it first took shape. Long before the legend of a golden city spread across oceans, it lived quietly in beliefs and stories of the people who inhabited the highlands of what is now Colombia. These communities, shaped by mountains that rose like ancient guardians and valleys that held centuries of memory, did not see gold the way later visitors would. To them, gold was not a currency, nor a measure of power, nor a treasure to be hoarded. It was a sacred material, a symbol of light, life, and eternal presence of their gods. It shimmered not with wealth, but with meaning. If you close your eyes and imagine the world they knew, it becomes easy to understand how the earliest whispers of the El Dorado myth took shape, without ever intending to promise riches. Picture a landscape where dawn breaks in gentle shades of gold and rose, where mist curls slowly along mountain ridges, and where lakes rest in perfect stillness beneath wide Andean skies. In such a place, it is no surprise that gold would take on a significance beyond ordinary understanding. It captured the brilliance of the sun, the breath of life, the promise of renewal. It was less an object and more a connection, a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Among these cultures, the Muisca stood out for their elaborate rituals and deep spiritual philosophies. They lived across a high plateau, cultivating the land, crafting intricate objects from gold, and weaving stories that connected them to the forces around them. Their world was rich non-material wealth, but in symbolism. Every object, every gesture, every offering carried layers of meaning, and it was understanding, not possession, that mattered most. Their stories were gentle, passed from voice to voice, shaped by the quiet rhythm of daily life. One of their most important beliefs centered around lakes. These bodies of water were seen as portals to the spiritual world, places where offerings could be given to gods in hopes of harmony, protection, or guidance. Lakes were still, reflective, mysterious, vast mirrors that held both the sky above and unseen depths below. They inspired reverence, careful attention, and rituals carried out with calm precision. It was within these sacred waters that the earliest spark of what would later be called El Dorado was born, a spark so subtle that the Muisca themselves never imagined it would ignite imaginations across continents. But myths do not emerge from a single moment. They grow from patterns, from fragments of truth woven into the fabric of belief. Gold dust sprinkled over the skin of rulers, shimmering figures seen across the water at dawn, offerings cast gently into the lake with quiet prayers. These scenes, viewed from within the culture, were simple expressions of faith. Yet to an outsider, unacquainted with the meaning behind them, they could appear extraordinary, even unreal. The movements of ritual, when observed without understanding, can transform into stories of wonder, mystery, or marvel. Imagine standing at the edge of one of these lakes centuries ago. The early morning is cool. The water is smooth as glass, holding the reflection of distant hills. Members of the community gather slowly, speaking in soft tones. No one is rushed. Everything unfolds with the peaceful deliberation of people deeply connected to their surroundings. The air carries a faint scent of earth and vegetation. When gold is brought out, not as treasure, but as an offering, it glows softly in the muted light. This is not a display of wealth. It is a conversation with the divine. It was scenes like these, witnessed by early travelers or described secondhand by those who passed through these lands, that planted the earliest seeds of the El Dorado narrative. A misunderstanding here, an exaggeration there, a story retold without its spiritual context. Piece by piece, the legend grew. Yet in its origin, The myth was never about a city or a kingdom or an empire overflowing with riches. It was about a relationship between people and the sacred, expressed through gold's symbolic beauty. In the calm of night, it is easy to imagine how these early stories drifted gently outward, carried by traders, wanderers, and those curious enough to ask questions. They spread slowly at first, like quiet ripples across a lake. There was nothing hurried or ambitious in their movement. Myths often travel this way, without intention, without direction, shaped only by the hands and voices that carry them. They move like dreams, changing subtly each time they pass from one person to another. As the myth began its journey beyond the mountains, it encountered listeners who did not share the Muisca worldview. For them, gold held a very different meaning. It was a symbol of wealth, a gateway to influence, a measure of power. So when they heard of ceremonies involving gold, they imagined abundance rather than devotion. When they learned of lakes filled with offerings, they pictured treasure rather than ritual. And when they heard of leaders adorned in gold dust, they envisioned kings of unimaginable riches, rather than spiritual figures honoring their gods. This gentle transformation from sacred ritual to imagined wealth happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. No moment marked the exact transition. No storyteller proclaimed that a golden city existed. Instead, the idea formed slowly, drifting between cultures until it took on a shape that the Muisca themselves would never have recognized. It became a myth not rooted in the beliefs that gave rise to it, but in the dreams and desires of those who heard it secondhand. Tonight, as this story unfolds softly into your awareness, the myth is still in its early stages. It is fragile, undefined, shimmering faintly at the edge of understanding. It has not yet grown into the legend that would inspire explorers to cross mountains, rivers, and dense forests. It has not yet transformed into a promise of wealth or a symbol of unending possibility. It is simply a misunderstanding wrapped around a truth born in reflection, in ritual, and the quiet reverence of people who saw gold not as a treasure, but as a bridge to the sacred. This is where the legend of El Dorado begins, not with ambition, but with meaning, not with greed, but with devotion. And as this journey continues, the gentle roots of this myth will soon meet the restless imagination of a world eager to interpret it in its own way. Across the highland of the Andes, where thin air carries the scent of damp earth in distant storms, the world of the Muisca people unfolded in quiet harmony. Their lands were shaped not by towering monuments or sprawling cities, but by a gentle interlacing of nature and community. The mountains rose around them like ancient stone guardians, their peaks fading into clouds that drifted lazily across the horizon. In the valleys below, the Muisca lived with a sense of balance that echoed the rhythm of the land itself. To understand the birth of the El Dorado legend, it is necessary to settle into this world, to let its atmosphere soften the mind, and see how meaning, ritual, and landscape blended together in ways later outsiders never fully understood. If you imagine the Muisca territory from above, it appears like a tapestry of rolling plains, shimmering lakes, and lush forests threaded between ridges. The mornings were often cool and misty, the kind of air that wraps gently around anyone stepping outside at dawn. The earth held ancient memories. Every hill and waterway had a story. Every patch of forest had a guardian. Nature was not something to conquer, but something to respect, and this respect shaped the culture as deeply as the mountains shaped the horizon. The Muisca people lived in small settlements, each one a cluster of round houses made from wood and clay, with roofs thatched from dry grasses. Smoke from morning fires drifted upward in thin, graceful lines. Children played quietly in open spaces, elders shared stories in hushed tones, and artisans worked with steady hands, shaping gold into delicate forms for spiritual use. Life was modest, but it was rich in meaning. Everything had a place, a purpose, a tone of balance that made their world feel both grounded and elevated. Gold held a special place in that world, not as currency but as a material infused with sacred significance. It symbolized warmth, vitality, and divine energy, the living breath of the sun embedded in metal. Muisca goldwork was intricate, gentle, and deeply symbolic. Small figures, pendants, ornaments, and offerings designed not to display wealth, but to honor the gods who shaped their destinies. These objects were messages, prayers cast into physical form. If you listen closely to the imagined environment, you can almost hear the rustling of grasses as wind moves across the plateau, or the distant call of birds echoing to the morning fog. This was a soundscape that framed the Muisca world, soft, natural, unhurried. In such a place, rituals did not feel theatrical or dramatic. They felt like extensions of daily life, performed in harmony with the environment rather than in opposition to it. Spirituality flowed through the landscape itself. At the heart of these beliefs were the lakes, still and mysterious bodies of water that held profound meaning. To the Muisca, lakes were living gateways, places where the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual realm grew thin. They believed that gods dwell within these depths, listening to the offerings left by humans. The water reflected the sky in ways that seemed almost magical, a shimmering mirror that connected earth and heaven in a single, sacred plane. Among these lakes, none held more significance than Lake Guatavita, a near-perfect circle carved by the hands of nature, surrounded by steep ridges covered in greenery. The water rested in a bowl of earth so peaceful and still that the slightest ripple looked like the breath of the world itself. Standing at its edge, one could feel the press of silence, a silence not empty, but full, as though the lake held centuries of unspoken stories. It is here, in this serene landscape, that the ritual surrounding the Zipa, one of the two main rulers of the Muisca, took place. The ceremony was one of renewal, connection, and spiritual continuity. But to understand the ceremony, one must picture the environment in which it unfolded. Imagine villagers gathering at dawn, carrying small figures, offerings, and ornaments made of gold. These offerings were not meant to be retrieved but to be given away, surrendered willingly to the depth of the lake, so that the gods might continue to watch over people with favor. As the sun rose, spreading warm light across the water, the scene would take on a quiet, glowing beauty. The surface of the lake shimmered in soft tones, not bright enough to dazzle, but gentle enough to instill a sense of awe. The ceremony itself was not a spectacle in the way modern minds might imagine. It was solemn, serene, a moment in which the community aligned itself with the sacred. Gold dust was applied to the Zipa's skin not to radiate power, but to symbolize purification, transformation, and spiritual readiness. It was a way of embodying the sun's warmth in a physical form. In this moment, standing atop a ceremonial raft, the Zipa represented not wealth but light. The raft itself was decorated with offerings, figurines, small plates, ornaments, all handcrafted by skilled artisans whose work was guided by tradition and devotion. The journey to the center of the lake was slow and steady, the oars stirring the water in long, quiet strokes. When the raft reached its center, the offerings were cast into the depths. The lake accepted them with a stillness that felt both sacred and comforting. To the Muisca people observing from the shore, this ritual was a reaffirmation of life, a quiet renewal of the harmony between humans, nature, and the gods. It was not a grand performance, but a deeply meaningful moment woven into the fabric of their world. No one thought of treasure. No one imagined hidden riches waiting to be discovered. The offerings belonged to the gods, not to the people. Yet this very ritual, the shimmering figure on the water, the gold dust catching the early light, the quiet descent of offerings into the lake, would later become the foundation for one of the greatest legends in history. Outsiders, hearing fragmented descriptions of what they could not fully understand, began to shape the story according to their own desires. But within the Muisca world itself, the ceremony remained what it had always been: peaceful, symbolic, sacred. As night settles deeper around you, imagine the lake as it once was, holding the reflection of a rising sun, holding centuries of ritual. This quiet world, shaped by meaning and harmony, is where the legend of El Dorado has its true roots, a place far gentler than the myth it would one day become. The early morning mist drifts lazily across the surface of Lake Guatavita, curling around the edges of reeds and rocks, blurring the line between water and sky. In this soft light, a single raft glides slowly from the shore, its wooden hull cutting to the stillness like a whisper. On the raft stands a Zipa, the ruler of the Muisca people, covered from head to toe in fine, shimmering gold dust. The tiny particles catch the faint glow of the sun as it begins to rise, scattering light across the water in gentle, moving patterns. It is not a spectacle meant to impress, but a quiet, meditative act of devotion, a ritual that has been performed for generations, each gesture carrying meaning deeper than any words could convey. Around the raft, Members of the community watch from the shoreline, their movements slow and deliberate. There is no rush. Children cling to the hands of their parents. Elders lean on walking sticks, all sharing in the calm gravity of the moment. The air is cool and slightly damp, carrying the earthy scent of surrounding forest and the faint sweetness of distant flowers. In these moments, every sound is muted, every movement deliberate, as though the world itself is slow to honor the ceremony. It is here in this quiet space that the ritual of the Gilded King unfolds, a ceremony so full of symbolism that it would later inspire awe, misunderstanding, and legend. The Zeepa's body, coated in gold, is not meant to dazzle for show. It is a sacred shroud, a way of becoming one with the sun and the divine forces that govern the world. Gold, in this context, is not wealth but transformation, a bridge between mortal and sacred, between earth and sky. Every movement, every breath, is infused with purpose. The community, watching in silence, shares a collective heartbeat of the ritual, a rhythm synchronized with the gentle lapping of water against the raft and the soft rustle of reeds swaying in the breeze. In this harmonious space, the boundary between human and divine feels almost imperceptible. On the raft, the Zeepa holds small objects in his hands, delicate figurines, ornaments, and tiny plates crafted with meticulous care by artisans whose skill has been passed down through generations. Each object is not simply decoration. It is an offering, a message to the gods. They are prayers made tangible, cast into forms that can carry intention and reverence. Slowly, with measured hands, the Zeepa begins to place these offerings onto the water, allowing them to drift and sink into the lake. The water embraces them without a sound, as if it has always known their purpose, as if it has been waiting for this quiet communion. As the raft drifts toward the center of the lake, the gold dust on the Zeepa's skin catches every soft glimmer of the sun, producing a shimmer that seems alive. The air feels warmer here, almost touched by something beyond the ordinary. There is a hush, a sense of suspended time. The ritual does not demand attention. It invites contemplation. To witness it is to step into a world that moves at the pace of breath and reflection, a world where meaning outweighs material, and where the shimmer of gold represents not ambition, but sacred connection. The ceremony is methodical. The Zeepa dips his hands into the water, scattering small particles of gold to create ripples that fan outward, intersecting and vanishing gently into the calm expanse. Each ripple is a signal, a symbol, a blessing. The offerings, cast one by one, form a quiet procession toward the hidden depths. There is a rhythm to these actions, a meditation in movement, a dance between the human and the divine. Time seems to stretch, elongating each gesture until it feels eternal, as though the ritual itself is part of the landscape, inseparable from the hills, the mist, and the reflective water. From the shore, the people watch without expectation or judgment. They do not anticipate treasure or gain. Their eyes rest upon the ritual with reverence, understanding the subtleties embedded in every movement. The silence is not empty. It is a tapestry of awareness, interwoven with the soft calls of distant birds, the whisper of the wind through trees, and the gentle lapping of water against a raft. In this suspended moment, everything exists in harmony, and the ritual becomes a living thread connecting generations, humans and nature, heaven and earth. The symbolism extends beyond the act itself. Gold represents not only the sun, but the spiritual light that guides a community. The lake is both mirror and portal, reflecting the sky while offering a connection to unseen worlds. The Zeepa embodies leadership that is not measured by conquest, but by guidance, humility, and devotion. Each element of the ritual, placement of offerings, the shimmer of gold, the raft gliding across water, intertwines with these concepts, producing a serene narrative understood without words, absorbed quietly into mind and spirit. It is this quiet, ceremonial essence that later travelers, arriving with their own expectations and dreams, would fail to grasp. To them, the gold was wealth, the lake a vault, and the Zeepa a king of unimaginable riches. They could not see the meditation in motion, the reverence for balance, the sacred intent. What they perceived as dazzling spectacle was, in truth, a gentle offering, a reflection of the Muisca worldview, serene and unhurried, and entirely divorced from material ambition. The beauty of the ritual was not meant to be possessed, only witnessed and respected. As the raft reaches the center of the lake, the Zipa completes the final offerings. The water, perfectly still now, accepts them with quiet grace, ripples spreading outward until they fade into calm once more. The ceremony concludes not with a declaration but with soft acknowledgement, the kind that exists naturally, without ceremony or applause. The Zipa slowly turns the raft back toward shore, carrying within the serenity of the ritual, the shared understanding of the people, and the sacred light of gold that will shimmer in memory long after the physical particles have sunk beneath the water. Tonight, as you imagine this scene, let the gentle motions of the raft, the shimmer of gold dust, the hush of the wind and water, settle your thoughts. The ceremony of the Gilded King is not just an event in the past. It is a quiet meditation and movement, a ritual that teaches patience, reflection, and reverence. Its essence drifts across time like a soft mist, touching the imagination of anyone willing to pause, watch, and feel the gentle rhythm of life in harmony with the sacred. In this calm, immersive space, the story of El Dorado begins to take shape. Not as a tale of greed or conquest, but as a whisper of devotion, ritual, and meaning that will echo through the ages. As the quiet rituals of the Muisca continued at their sacred lakes, far across the Atlantic, whispers of these distant practices began to drift into Europe. These whispers were fragile at first, fragmented conversations carried by travelers, merchants, and missionaries who ventured into the unknown. They spoke of men covered in gold dust, of shimmering objects cast into still lakes, and of ceremonies that seemed as luminous as sunlight itself. To those who had never seen such places, the descriptions were almost dreamlike, fragile stories that balanced between reality and imagination. And yet, despite the distance, these stories began to take root, germinating slowly in minds attuned to ambition and curiosity. In the great courts of Spain, these tales stirred quiet fascination. The Spanish Empire, riding on the crest of its early conquests in the Americas, was hungry for wealth, driven by debts, and eager to expand influence across distant lands. Gold was not just a material of beauty. It was the lifeblood of empire, a measure of power, and a symbol of divine favor. So when stories arrived at a distant land where a ruler adorned in gold performed sacred rituals, where lakes reflected sunlight on treasures offered to gods, it was almost impossible for the European imagination to see these events as anything other than the promise of wealth. The stories were filtered through desire, distorted not by malice, but by longing. These early accounts often traveled in letters, oral reports, or chronicles that mixed observation with exaggeration. A missionary writing home might describe a ceremony with careful reverence, noting the piety of the people. But by the time the story reached a nobleman, an investor, or a mapmaker, the emphasis had shifted. Gold became the focus, the ritual transformed into spectacle, and the distant lakes became repositories of unimaginable riches waiting to be claimed. The gentle reality of Muisca devotion was replaced in European minds by visions of cities paved in gold, of kings surrounded by treasure, of a paradise of wealth hidden deep within the mountains. It is easy to imagine the fascination these stories created. In quiet halls illuminated by candlelight, advisors and explorers pored over reports, tracing rivers, mountains, and valleys on fragile maps. They debated whether the tales were exaggerated, whether they were worth pursuing, and how to translate vague descriptions into actionable plans. Each detail, each fragment of gold dust, became a spark in the imagination, fanned by ambition and curiosity. The unknown nature of the Americas only made the stories more tantalizing. Everything was distant, mysterious, and almost beyond comprehension. The mind, craving certainty, filled the gaps with visions of wealth beyond measure. The Muisca rituals themselves, however, remained unknown to these European interpreters. They did not see the lake as sacred. They did not see gold as symbolic of the sun or divine favor. Instead, they interpreted everything through their own cultural lens, a lens shaped by desire, empire, and a belief that wealth equated to power. In this way, the myth began its transformation. What had been a sacred ritual became, in European imagination, the first glimmer of El Dorado, a king or city bathed in gold, waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to cross mountains and forests. Travelers who ventured into the New World were often unprepared for the landscapes they encountered. The mountains were higher than expected, the forests denser, the rivers longer and more treacherous than maps suggested. Yet these difficulties did little to dim the allure of the story. Every obstacle became part of the legend, every failure a testament to the richness of what might lie beyond. Europeans returned with tales that were part report, part dream, part exaggeration, and in each retelling, the myth grew, gaining more substance, more intrigue, more shimmering promise. The contrast between the original ritual and the European interpretation is striking. The Muisca ceremony was calm, reverent, deeply symbolic, and slow. The European imagination saw spectacle, abundance, and the possibility of immense wealth. Both perspectives were sincere. Both were rooted in observation, yet shaped by vastly different cultural priorities. This contrast is part of what made the story so enduring. It was, in a way, a bridge between worlds, a shared fascination with gold, but interpreted in ways that suited each observer's desires and needs. Even as European explorers began to organize expeditions, they carried with them not just maps and supplies, but also the weight of expectation. Every lake, every river, every peak became a potential clue, a puzzle piece in the search for the legendary city. And while the Muisca continued their rituals, unaware of the distant imaginations they had ignited, the myth began to move faster than the reality, propelled by the hopes, greed, and curiosity of those who dreamed of gold. It was no longer just a local ritual. It had become a story with the power to inspire voyages across oceans, to reshape ambitions, and to transform distant landscapes into spaces of legendary possibility. As night falls gently across your mind, imagine this story traveling slowly, like a feather carried on a breeze, crossing oceans and continents. Picture the contrast between the serene, sacred lake in the Andes and the bustling, candlelit chambers of Spain, where the legend first took root. Feel the quiet patience of the Muisca rituals, and then the restless curiosity of the European listeners. In the tension between these two worlds, the myth begins to solidify, taking on shapes and details that will persist for centuries. It is a story of misinterpretation, of longing, and of the subtle ways human imagination transforms reality into legend. And so, the myth of El Dorado, still fragile and unformed, begins to whisper across continents. It is no longer just a story of ritual. It is a story of hope, ambition, and the deep human desire to find something extraordinary hidden just beyond reach. Each retelling stretches the imagination further, adding sparkle and brilliance to the legend while drifting farther from its origin. Yet even as it transforms, the myth retains a quiet, almost meditative beauty, a resonance that will continue to captivate those willing to follow its gentle, shimmering thread into the heart of history. Spain in the early 16th century was a world of contrasts, a land of sunlit plazas and shadowed corridors, of grand cathedrals and quiet villages, of wealth and debt, of ambition and restraint. Its empire was expanding, reaching across oceans to lands that most of its citizens could only imagine. The cities were filled with the sounds of merchants counting coins, of priests reciting prayers, and of nobles plotting fortunes that could reshape kingdoms. Yet beneath the surface of this expanding empire was a constant pressure, a restlessness born from debt, competition, and the ever-present desire for gold. Gold was not just a luxury. It was a necessity, a tangible measure of power and influence that could determine the fate of empires, dynasties, and individuals alike. It was in this context that whispers of a distant land, full of gold and mystery, reached the Spanish courts. The stories, carried by travelers, merchants, and missionaries, arrived like flickers of sunlight through a dense forest, sometimes dim, sometimes brilliant, always intriguing. Accounts describe men covered in gold dust, lakes sparkling with offerings, and ceremonies that seemed almost magical in their beauty. To the Europeans, these stories were more than curiosity. They were a promise, a possibility that their ambitions could be fulfilled in lands yet unclaimed. And the imagination of Spain, hungry for wealth and glory, could not resist the allure. Spain's hunger for gold was more than mere desire. The empire carried the weight of enormous debts, partly from financing wars, partly from maintaining its sprawling bureaucracy, and partly from competing with rival nations. Coins were minted and melted down, lent and borrowed, and yet always seemed insufficient. Every report of gold from a new world felt like a potential solution, a glimmer of relief from economic pressure. It was not greed alone that drove the fascination with El Dorado. It was necessity intertwined with aspiration. Gold represented stability, security, and the chance to leave an indelible mark on history. Yet the desire for gold also revealed deeper psychological currents. In a world where ambition and achievement were measured in material wealth, gold became a symbol not only of empire but of personal worth. The thought of a distant king, covered in gold dust, performing sacred rituals, created a tension between awe and envy. What was sacred to the Muisca became a mirror for European desires, a way to project hopes and ambitions onto a faraway land. The stories offered a perfect combination: mystery, beauty, and the tantalizing suggestion that untold riches could be seized, possessed, and brought home. Maps, letters, and chronicles became tools in the slow obsession. Each description of distant rivers, mountains, and lakes was studied, interpreted, and often embellished. Cartographers, working by candlelight, traced lines that connected fragments of rumor and observation, forming pathways to imagined cities of gold. Explorers and soldiers read these reports, planning expeditions that would take them into forests so dense they almost seemed to swallow light. Every voyage was fraught with danger, yet the promise of gold pushed men onward, past exhaustion, past fear, past uncertainty. The myth of El Dorado was shaping not only imagination but action, directing lives and destinies with quiet authority. The psychology of desire and expectation worked subtly, almost imperceptibly. Tales of gold began to color perception even before Europeans set foot in South America. Observers anticipated wealth, projected fantasies onto unknown landscapes, and interpreted natural features as markers of treasure. A reflective lake became a repository of gold. A sunlit cliff suggested hidden riches. A ceremonial raft adorned with gold dust became the center of a kingdom of unimaginable wealth. The reality of the land was muted by imagination, yet that imagination carried power. Power to drive expeditions, to inspire maps, and to transform history. Yet there was also a tension, a contrast between hope and reality. The rivers of South America were long and unpredictable, the mountains steep and foggy, the forest dense and filled with unknown sounds. For every tale of gold, there were countless stories of exhaustion, loss, and frustration. Men who believed they were following signs of treasure often found only empty valleys or sacred lakes, places meant for devotion rather than possession. And yet the myth endured, fueled by the persistent human tendency to see desire in every shadow, to hear possibility in every distant ripple of water. Even as expeditions were planned, Spain remained a land of quiet reflection at night, with candlelight flickering on stone walls and the occasional sigh of weary officials. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado floated through minds like a gentle mist, at once alluring and unattainable. The contrast between the calm, sacred rituals of the Muisca and the fervent ambitions of European explorers was striking, almost dreamlike. It is in this contrast that the story gains its richness, its subtle tension, and its enduring fascination. The ritual gold of the Andes and the imagined gold of Europe existed in parallel, influencing one another without ever fully intersecting. The tension between ambition and reverence, between desire and understanding, would continue to drive the story forward. As Europe dreamed of empires paved with gold, the sacred ceremonies of the Muisca continued quietly, unnoticed and untouched by foreign ambition. And yet, even from afar, the ripple of that gold dust and ceremonial lakes had begun to reach the world beyond the mountains, shaping ambitions, inspiring voyages, and creating a legend that would persist for centuries. The allure of El Dorado was no longer just a story. It had become a force, guiding minds and shaping actions with gentle but irresistible pull. In this slow, unfolding moment, it is easy to feel the weight of time stretching across oceans. Imagine candlelit rooms filled with maps, letters, and whispered conversations, all tracing paths to imagined treasures. Imagine the mountains, lakes, and forests of the Andes, still serene, still sacred, holding their meaning in quiet defiance of distant desires. The contrast between these worlds, the restless, ambitious Spain and the calm, devoted Muisca, creates a rhythm in the story, a gentle tension that sustains curiosity while still allowing the mind to rest. It is this balance between intrigue and serenity, between myth and reality, that allows the legend of El Dorado to take hold in history and in imagination. As night deepens, let your thoughts drift slowly between these two worlds. Feel the tension, yet do not grasp it. Sense the allure of gold in distant lands. yet remain rooted in the calm understanding that the original rituals were never about treasure. Let the rhythm of rivers, the hush of mountains, and the quiet of lakes echo in your mind. And in this gentle awareness, the story moves forward, guided by human desire, cultural misunderstanding, an enduring pull of a legend that continues to shimmer across time and imagination. The first explorers to set foot in the highlands of South America moved with a mixture of hope, exhaustion, and quiet awe. Their ships had crossed vast oceans, leaving behind familiar coasts, languages, and customs, only to arrive in a world so different that it seemed almost otherworldly. The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks hidden in clouds, their slopes carpeted with dense forest that whispered with every breeze. Rivers wound unpredictably through the valleys, carrying with them the scent of unknown vegetation and the distant sounds of wildlife. The explorers had maps, stories, and dreams, yet the land itself offered no guarantees, only vast stretches of mystery waiting to be slowly understood. Imagine stepping into that environment, feeling the damp earth underfoot, hearing the soft, steady murmur of rivers, and watching fog drift across steep ridges. Each step was uncertain, yet purposeful. These early expeditions were often slow, not from hesitation, but from the sheer scale of the landscapes and the challenges they presented. Thick vegetation made travel arduous. Insects and animals, unfamiliar and sometimes intimidating, were constant companions. Rain fell unpredictably, soft at times, relentless at others, soaking clothes, boots, and spirits alike. And yet, the explorers pressed onward, driven not by greed alone, but by the subtle lure of a story that promised more than mere adventure, a legend of gold and wonder, one that had traveled across oceans and cultures, shaping hope before the first foot had even touched the mountains. The travelers relied on a combination of guides, sketches, and the whispered directions of local communities, though understanding often remained incomplete. Each village they passed through offered glimpses of a way of life entirely unlike their own. The people were quiet, observant, and careful in their interactions, wary of outsiders yet sometimes willing to share knowledge. Even brief glimpses of their rituals, of ceremonial objects made of gold, or of lakes that seemed perfectly still and sacred, left deep impressions on the European imagination. These moments were often misinterpreted, filtered through a lens of ambition and desire, yet they contributed to the slow formation of the El Dorado legend. Movement through the terrain required extraordinary patience. The forest canopy muted sound, making the footsteps of men seem heavier in the hushed atmosphere. Every stream crossed demanded careful navigation, every steep incline careful planning. Insects buzzed, birds called in distant harmonies, and the air was thick with moisture and the faint scent of decomposing leaves. Travelers often paused to rest, to adjust their equipment, to take note of the terrain. These pauses were moments for reflection, though they were often infused with anticipation. Each participant aware that the next bend in the river or the next ridge might reveal signs of gold, of cities, or of wonder beyond imagination. Despite the exhaustion and the relentless challenge of the land, there was a meditative quality to the journey. Hours of walking, of rowing along rivers, or climbing ridges offered time for observation and reflection. The explorers began to notice patterns in the environment, how sunlight filtered through the canopy, how the wind moved across mountains, how mist hugged valleys in the early hours. These patterns, while subtle, added texture to their understanding of the land, and, in turn, shaped the myths they carried with them. Every reflection on the beauty, danger, and strangeness of the landscape fed the narrative of a land waiting to reveal hidden treasures, shimmering like a dream beneath dense foliage. The psychological impact of such journeys was profound. Being immersed in an environment so unlike their homelands forced explorers to confront both awe and fear. The mountains and rivers were indifferent to human ambition, and yet they seemed alive, almost sentient, shaping the movements and decisions of those who crossed them. Every night, as the travelers set up camp, they listened to the soft sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the slow trickle of streams. And these sounds, though calming to some, amplified the sense of isolation and anticipation. Their minds, caught between reality and imagination, allowed the legend of El Dorado to grow larger, more detailed, and more compelling with every step. The contrast between expectation and reality was a constant companion. Travelers who had imagined cities paved in gold were confronted instead with lakes, rivers, and mountains, magnificent in their own right, but not yielding immediate treasure. And yet, each natural feature was interpreted as a clue. A reflective lake became a mirror for imagined wealth. A gleaming rock face hinted at hidden deposits. A ceremonial raft in a distant settlement sparked visions of kingdoms built entirely of gold. This interpretive lens, shaped by desire, allowed the myth to persist, bridging the gap between the serene reality of the land and the fervent imagination of the explorers. Interactions with indigenous communities, though brief, also shaped perception. Language barriers, cultural differences, and ritual misunderstandings meant that much of what the Europeans witnessed was filtered through their own expectations. A sacred ritual, performed with reverence and calm, might be described as opulent, extraordinary, or otherworldly. A small offering of gold to the lake could be misinterpreted as part of a larger hoard. Each interaction, each observation, added layers to the legend, building a story that was increasingly removed from the original meaning, yet more compelling to those seeking gold and glory. Time moved differently on these journeys. Days blurred together in a rhythm of walking, rowing, observing, and reflecting. The explorers began to internalize the landscape, absorbing its moods and patterns. Mist rising over a mountain in the early morning could feel like a herald of possibility. A sudden clearing in the forest could be interpreted as a sign or invitation. The slow accumulation of these impressions, combined with letters, reports, and stories sent back to Europe, allowed the legend of El Dorado to evolve almost organically, growing with each retelling, each memory, each misinterpreted observation. And so, the first expeditions through the Andes were defined by a delicate balance. The weight of physical hardship tempered by the expansiveness of imagination. The monotony of relentless travel countered by fleeting glimpses of beauty and mystery. The calm persistence of the landscape contrasted with the restless desire for gold and wonder. In this interplay, the story of El Dorado began to take shape in a way that was both grounded in real ritual and myth and elevated by the interpretations of those who sought it. It was a legend in motion, carried along paths of rivers, valleys, and mountains, growing as it traveled. As night falls on this journey, imagine the explorers pausing by a quiet stream, the mountains looming softly under fading light, the forest breathing in unison with the wind. Hear the faint rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a bird, the gentle ripple of water. These small sounds anchor the story, reminding us that while human ambition drives exploration and imagination, the world itself remains calm, timeless, and indifferent. In this stillness, the first footsteps toward El Dorado leave traces not only in the earth, but in memory, imagination, and the slow accumulation of myth that will continue to unfold across centuries. The explorers who ventured into the highlands were drawn, again and again, to tales of a sacred lake that shimmered in the sunlight, a body of water said to hold gold as offerings to the gods. Lake Guadavita became a symbol in their minds, a focus for imagination and hope. To the Europeans, it was not just water. It was a gateway to unimaginable wealth, a place where centuries of ritual had deposited gold into the waiting depths. Each story they heard, each whispered account from local guides or travelers, seemed to confirm that here, somewhere on the calm surface of the lake, treasure waited to be claimed. And so, the lake, serene and still, became the center of the first obsessive attempts to uncover the legend of El Dorado. Picture the lake as it might have appeared to those first ambitious outsiders. A perfect circle, surrounded by softly sloping ridges, the waters calm and reflective under a pale sun. Mist rose in the early morning, curling across the surface, hiding depth and detail alike, creating an almost mystical presence. The forest around the lake was thick, a wall of green that whispered softly with each passing breeze. Every movement of water or rustle of leaf seemed imbued with hidden significance, a subtle nudge to the imagination that told the explorers, somewhere beneath the serene calm lies the gold of legends. The first attempts to retrieve the offerings were cautious, tentative, and slow. Explorers approached the lake with respect mingled with eagerness, sending small groups in canoes or rafts across the mirror-like water. They had learned from locals that the offerings were sacred, but their interpretations quickly shifted from devotion to treasure, from ritual to opportunity. Each ripple in the water seemed to reflect not only the sky above, but also the possibilities that danced in their minds. Every shimmer of sunlight on the surface was imagined as a glint of gold waiting to be seized, a signal of what lay beneath the calm exterior. The techniques they used were primitive by today's standards, but they were ingenious for their time. Nets, hooks, and rudimentary diving devices were employed to reach the depths, often with great risk. Men would descend into dark, cold water, groping blindly, hoping to feel a metallic texture of an offering long submerged. Others would tie ropes to rafts or poles, attempting to sweep the lake floor. Yet despite their ingenuity, the lake revealed its secrets only slowly, teasing the explorers with occasional glimpses of gold, fragments of ceremonial objects, or sunlit reflections that sparked renewed hope. The tension between desire and reality grew with every expedition, as the lake remained mostly impenetrable and silent. Even as the physical efforts continued, the psychological effect on those attempting to claim the treasure was profound. Day after day, men wrestled with frustration, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The dense forest surrounding the lake seemed to whisper warnings they could not understand. The sun's reflection glimmered on the water in ways that suggested both promise and illusion. The mist that rolled over the lake in the morning gave it an ethereal quality, making it seem like a place suspended in time, untouched by human ambition, yet impossible to ignore. Each failed attempt did not diminish the myth. It made it grow, feeding the imagination with stories of what could be rather than what was. Local communities, familiar with the sacred nature of the lake, watched these attempts with quiet concern. To them, the lake was not a repository of wealth, but a place of spiritual significance, a site where offerings were meant to remain undisturbed, a connection between the mortal and the divine. The intrusion of foreign ambition disrupted the serenity, yet also added to the growing legend. Misinterpretations by outsiders transformed ritual into rumor, devotion into treasure, and mystery into obsession. The lake, which had once existed purely as a place of reflection and reverence, was now layered with the expectations, desires, and dreams of explorers from across the ocean. Each unsuccessful attempt seemed only to enhance the allure. Stories returned to Europe describing the lake as both unreachable and tantalizingly rich. Some travelers spoke of divers bringing back small amounts of gold dust or tiny objects, enough to convince audiences that the treasure was real but vast, hidden beneath layers of water and mud. The imagination could fill in the gaps, and imagination was a powerful currency. Maps began to mark the location more prominently. Explorers prepared new expeditions, and the myth grew with each retelling. In this way, the reality of the lake and the ritual objects it contained became intertwined with dreamlike possibilities, creating a legend that was both grounded and fantastical. As night falls softly across this imagined landscape, picture the explorers at the water's edge, their equipment scattered around, the scent of damp earth and wetwood filling the air. The mist thickens, curling across the water, hiding the surface and deepening the mystery. Canoes drift quietly. Men lean forward with ropes and nets in hand, their eyes searching for reflections of gold, their thoughts consumed by possibilities. The lake remains still, indifferent to effort, expectation, and desire. It offers only subtle hints, a flicker of sunlight, a distant shadow, the ripple of water as if breathing slowly beneath the surface. The contrast between the serene, sacred purpose of the Muisca and the eager, anxious ambition of the European explorers could not be greater. For the Muisca, the gold was a bridge to the divine, a symbol of harmony, a reflection of the sun and spiritual continuity. For the explorers, the gold was a prize, a measure of wealth, and the key to status and power. This tension, this difference in perception, is part of what made the story so enduring. It highlights the way myths evolve, shaped not only by original meaning but by the expectations and desires of those who encounter them. In this tension, the legend becomes more than a story. It becomes a living, breathing narrative that stretches across cultures and generations. Despite repeated failures, the obsession with Lake Guatavita intensified. Each setback was interpreted as a hint that the treasure was vast and hidden cleverly, demanding skill and persistence. The lake, serene and silent, became a mirror for human hope and imagination. Its calm waters reflected the sky above and the ambitions below, creating a space where myth and reality intertwined seamlessly. Every glimmer on the surface, every movement of mist, every whisper of wind seemed to suggest that the legend was just out of reach, waiting for those bold enough to claim it. And so, as the explorers labored and the lake remained calm, the story of El Dorado continued to grow in the collective imagination. It became a symbol of desire, ambition, and human fascination with the unknown. The lake, silent and still, kept its secrets while simultaneously inspiring dreams that stretched far beyond its shores. In this quiet, immersive space, the myth evolved naturally, moving between reality and imagination, between devotion and obsession, carrying with it the timeless allure that would continue to captivate hearts and minds for generations to come. As the explorers pressed further into the highlands, the mountains rose before them like silent sentinels, their peaks lost in clouds that seemed to touch the heavens. Each step became an exercise in patience and endurance. Paths that appeared on maps were often misleading, turning into narrow, winding trails through dense forests or rocky slopes that demanded careful footing. The rivers that flowed between the ridges were deep and fast, carrying water that was cold, clear, and unyielding. Crossing them required ingenuity, cooperation, and sometimes sheer brute force. Every challenge heightened both fatigue and anticipation, as the legend of El Dorado whispered to the minds of the travelers, urging them onward. In these quiet, remote landscapes, the explorers felt the enormity of the world pressing in on them. The forests were alive with sounds unfamiliar to European ears, the rustling of unseen animals, the calls of exotic birds, the distant splash of water over rocks. The air was thick with moisture, and the scent of damp earth and foliage clung to clothing, hair, and skin. These natural elements, though challenging, also inspired awe. Each glimpse of sunlight breaking through canopy, each reflection in a slow-moving stream, each flutter of mist across a valley, became imbued with symbolic significance. To the travelers, the landscape itself seemed to speak of mystery and promise, shaping the way they interpreted the legend of El Dorado. The deeper they traveled, the more tenuous their grasp on reality became. Days of walking, climbing, and navigating unfamiliar terrain created a rhythm of exhaustion, reflection, and anticipation. Sleep, when it came, was short and often uneasy, filled with dreams of gold, of distant cities hidden in the mountains, of shimmering lakes. Each night, as they lay beneath the stars, the explorers imagined possibilities that stretched beyond the physical landscape. They were haunted and inspired by visions of wealth, status, and power, their minds filling in details that the rivers, forests, and peaks themselves would never reveal. In this way, imagination merged with exploration, forming a feedback loop that intensified the allure of the legend. Interactions with indigenous people along the way were brief but impactful. Guides, interpreters, and local villagers offered fragments of knowledge, directions to certain lakes, descriptions of rituals or stories of past ceremonies, but always filtered through cultural understanding that the Europeans could not fully grasp. A quiet ceremony at a distant lake, a figure adorned with gold dust, or a ceremonial raft could be interpreted as proof of untold treasure. These glimpses were tantalizing, yet incomplete, creating a tension between curiosity and frustration. Every new observation added layers to the myth, increasing its perceived richness while drifting further from the original meaning. Explorers began to adopt strategies that blended patience with urgency. Scouts were sent ahead to survey valleys, rafts were prepared to cross calm lakes, and rudimentary diving techniques were employed to search for gold in water too deep to see clearly. Men worked in teams, communicated with hand signals or whispers, moving slowly to avoid alerting the surrounding wildlife or alarming local communities. Every careful motion, every deliberate search, carried a sense of ritual itself, though motivated by human desire rather than spiritual devotion. Even in their exhaustion, the explorers' movements were precise, almost meditative, reflecting a deep, if unintentional, connection with the rhythm of the landscape. Yet the Andes were not passive observers. Rainstorms could appear without warning, turning trails into slick ribbons of mud and forcing travelers to halt or retreat. Rivers swelled, making crossings dangerous or impossible. Mist and fog could obscure landmarks, disorienting even the most experienced guides. Every expedition faced the constant challenge of adapting to the environment, which in turn shaped the narrative of the legend. The more inaccessible the terrain, the greater the imagined value of the hidden treasure. The difficulty of the journey became a measure of the gold's worth in the minds of those pursuing it, reinforcing the myth's allure and heightening its perceived magnificence. The psychological dimension of these journeys cannot be overstated. Hours spent in silence, navigating forests or climbing ridges, allowed the mind to wander into possibilities. A shimmer of sunlight on a lake could be interpreted as a clue. A glint of gold dust among ceremonial objects could seem to promise abundance. Each moment of doubt was counterbalanced by hope. The human mind, operating in isolation and challenge, naturally filled gaps with expectation. In this way, every setback became part of the legend, every misstep a prelude to discovery, every reflection in water a glimmer of imagined wealth. The legend of El Dorado was as much a product of perception as it was a physical reality. Over time, some explorers began to rely less on maps and more on intuition, following the contours of valleys, the flow of rivers, and the patterns of clouds and mist. These instincts, however imperfect, guided them toward ceremonial lakes, sacred highlands, and communities whose rituals hinted at the origins of the gold legend. Each discovery, no matter how small, was interpreted as validation. A fragment, an offering here, a gold object there, a description from a villager confirming what they already hoped to find. The interplay between observation, imagination, and expectation created a narrative that became increasingly self-reinforcing, driving the explorers ever onward despite the physical challenges of the Andes. Despite hardships and repeated disappointments, the explorers' focus on Lake Guatavita intensified. It became the symbol of possibility, the locus of obsession, and the center of countless expeditions. Its calm waters reflected not just the sky, but the hope, fear, and ambition of all who approached. Men lingered at its edges, studying its contours, planning strategies, and imagining the treasures below. The lake's serenity contrasted sharply with the intensity of human desire, its stillness serving as a mirror for both the physical landscape and the turbulent inner worlds of those who sought its secrets. Every ripple, every glint of sunlight on the water became imbued with significance, feeding the imagination in ways that were both compelling and calming. As evening falls over these highlands, picture the explorers at rest near a gently flowing stream, the mountains fading into purple shadows, mist curling across the valley. The forest seems to hold its breath, the wind barely moving, the distant call of a bird echoing softly. In this quiet, immersive moment, the legend of El Dorado lingers, not as reality, but as a living thread of human desire, imagination, and persistence. The contrast between the serene, sacred purpose of the original rituals and the intense ambition of European explorers continues to define the story, creating a rhythm of tension and calm, anticipation and reflection that carries the legend forward across time and imagination. The expeditions into the Andes grew increasingly ambitious, and the explorers' obsession with El Dorado intensified with each passing day. Rivers flowed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, their currents carrying both hope and fatigue to the minds of those who followed them. Every valley crossed, every peak climbed, revealed landscapes of quiet beauty and formidable challenge. The forest canopy overhead filtered sunlight into scattered beams, illuminating patches of moss, fallen leaves, and distant streams. The air was damp, carrying the scent of soil, wet wood, and the faint fragrance of flowers hidden deep within the foliage. Each step seemed both arduous and sacred, as though the land itself demanded respect, while simultaneously teasing with promise. The deeper the explorers went, the more the landscape seemed to shape their imagination. Mountains rose in jagged silhouettes against the sky, clouds hugging the slopes like gentle blankets. Rivers branched unpredictably, sometimes calm, sometimes roaring over rocky beds. The explorers had maps, but maps could not capture the shifting mist, the hidden bends of trails, or the secret alcoves of lakes. With each turn of the path, every faint glimmer of sunlight on water or distant cliff, hope and anticipation surged. It was as if the land itself whispered encouragement, urging them forward toward a treasure that might or might not exist. And in that whisper, every man heard what he wished most to hear, the promise of gold, wealth, and the extraordinary. As the days passed, exhaustion became both companion and adversary. Men trudged through mud, struggled along narrow ridges, and waded across cold streams. Their bodies ached, their feet blistered, their muscles sore. Yet with every challenge, the allure of El Dorado persisted, fueling a quiet obsession. Sleep came fitfully, often interrupted by dreams of cities glittering with gold or lakes reflecting sunlight like molten metal. In these moments, imagination and memory intertwined, the mind blurring the boundary between reality and myth. A glimmer in the forest became a hidden stash. A distant reflection on water became proof of treasures waiting just beyond reach. The landscape, serene and indifferent, was transformed by the explorer's hopes into a living, breathing stage for the unfolding legend. Interactions with local communities added layers of both knowledge and misunderstanding. Villagers offered guidance, sometimes hesitant, sometimes helpful, but always filtered through language, culture, and caution. Observations of rituals, ceremonies, and gold-covered offerings were interpreted as evidence of the mythical city. Even when the evidence was fragmentary, tiny objects, a few gold nuggets, ceremonial attire, it was magnified in the minds of the explorers. Each encounter, however brief, contributed to the narrative of El Dorado, shaping strategy and expectation. The sacred practices of Muisca were reframed in European imagination as clues, breadcrumbs on a path to unimaginable wealth. The lake that had drawn the first expeditions, Lake Guatavita, remained a focal point of obsession. Its still surface seemed to conceal both history and treasure, reflecting the sky above while guarding its depths from eager hands. Explorers would spend days preparing rafts, hooks, and nets, moving cautiously across the water, attempting to reach objects submerged for generations. The lake's surface shimmered in sunlight, sometimes revealing glints that appeared to promise discovery, only to vanish when approached. Each failure heightened anticipation, reinforcing perception that the treasure was immense and well hidden. The calm of the lake contrasted sharply with the restless energy of those who sought to claim it, creating a tension between serenity and desire. Efforts to retrieve gold were painstaking and often perilous. Men descended into cold water with minimal equipment, groping blindly for objects that might be ceremonial rather than material. Rafts were tied to ropes, dragged across the lake in careful sweeps, while others probed the edges for fragments of offerings. The water, deep and opaque, resisted all attempt at exploration. Mist rose in the mornings, curling across the surface, adding an almost dreamlike quality to the labor. Every ripple in the water, every glint of sunlight became a signal, whether real or imagined, feeding the relentless pursuit. Despite the difficulties, the persistence of human desire made each expedition seem worthwhile, each challenge a necessary step toward imagined glory. The psychological toll of these repeated attempts was immense. Men endured long hours, often in silence, navigating forests, lakes, and mountains that seemed indifferent to human effort. Fatigue and expectation merged, creating a dreamlike state in which reality and imagination became difficult to separate. A shimmer on the water could be gold, or it could be sunlight dancing across ripples. A glint beneath a raft could be an offering or a simple rock reflecting light. Yet each perception carried significance, shaping both action and anticipation. In this interplay between effort and hope, failure became a driver of obsession, reinforcing the myth even as the physical treasure remained elusive. Despite setbacks, determination persisted. Plans grew more elaborate with larger teams, extended supply lines, and increasingly sophisticated tools. Explorers scouted valleys, monitored weather, and studied the lake with meticulous attention. Every day offered new observations, new interpretations, and renewed determination. Yet the lake, serene and impenetrable, offered no reassurance, no hint of completion. Its stillness was both frustrating and compelling, a mirror for the explorer's aspirations and a testament to the enduring power of mystery. The more they struggled to conquer it, the stronger the legend became, weaving together real rituals, imagined wealth, and human obsession. Nightfall brought moments of quiet reflection. By the fires, explorers would sit, exhausted and contemplative, listening to the faint sounds of water lapping against rafts or the distant rustle of trees. Shadows stretched across the valley, and the stars above seemed distant yet intimately connected to the land. In these moments, the interplay between human desire and the calm serenity of the Andes became most evident. The legend of El Dorado was alive not just in physical exploration, but in imagination, in hope, and in persistent tension between ambition and respect for the land. Each failure, each glimpse of shimmering water, Each fragment of gold became part of a larger narrative that transcended reality. And so, the obsession with El Dorado deepened. The lakes, rivers, and mountains of the Andes were not just terrain. They were stages on which the human mind enacted a story of longing, persistence, and myth. Every expedition, whether successful or not, reinforced a narrative. The calm, reflective water of Lake Guadavita, the misty ridges, and the dense forest all became characters in a quiet, immersive story that continues to captivate imagination. The tension between the sacred rituals of the Muisca and the relentless ambition of European explorers created a rhythm, one of anticipation, reflection, and subtle wonder, that sustains a legend, shaping it into a story that moves across time as gently and persistently as water over stone. The first major attempts to recover gold from Lake Guadavita brought a mixture of exhilaration, frustration, and quiet reflection. Early explorers approached with careful planning, hauling rafts, ropes, and nets across the surrounding forest, carrying the weight of expectation as heavily as the weight of their equipment. The sun filtered through the thick canopy, scattering light across mossy stones and glistening leaves, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if the land itself were aware of their anticipation. Every ripple on the lake's surface reflected not just sunlight, but dreams of fortune, and every shadow beneath the water suggested hidden wealth waiting to be claimed. These early attempts required patience and precision. Men worked together in small groups, communicating with soft signals, moving deliberately across rafts that rocked gently in the calm water. They reached with poles, hooked objects from the depths, and waded cautiously along the edges, careful not to disturb the fragile ecosystem or attract unwanted attention from the surrounding forest. Despite the care, progress was slow. Objects that were recovered were small, sometimes just a fragment of a ceremonial offering or a single nugget of gold. Yet even these minor successes were celebrated as proof that the lake held treasures beyond imagination. Every glimpse of metal glittering beneath the surface was magnified in the minds of the explorers, reinforcing both hope and obsession. The lake itself seemed indifferent to these efforts. Mist would rise in the early morning, curling over the surface like ghostly fingers, obscuring the depths and hiding all secrets. Ripples caused by wind or wildlife were interpreted as signs or warnings, and yet, no matter how careful or skillful the explorers were, the vast majority of the lake remained silent, still, and unreachable. This silence, far from discouraging, only fed the imagination. In the quiet reflection of its waters, the explorers saw what they wished to see: glimpses of gold, signs of abundance, the promise of a legendary city just beneath the surface. Time moved slowly around the lake. Hours stretched into days as men repeated their efforts, each attempt exhausting their bodies while sharpening their focus. Their eyes became attuned to the smallest glimmers, their hands more sensitive to the faintest vibrations transmitted through ropes and poles. Every minor success was a spark that ignited renewed energy, while every failure was a gentle nudge to persist further. The rhythm of labor, pause, observation, and reflection created a meditative cycle, allowing imagination and expectation to merge seamlessly with physical reality. The lake was at once a challenge and a teacher, demanding patience while rewarding subtle awareness. Interactions with the surrounding forest and communities added complexity to the expeditions. Indigenous guides offered insight into terrain, ceremonial practices, and hidden pathways, though much of their knowledge was filtered through cultural contexts that the explorers could only partially understand. Observations of local rituals, of offerings left in the water, or of ceremonial objects displayed in villages were interpreted as direct evidence of treasure. Each interaction, brief or extended, added depth to the legend of El Dorado, blending fact with imagination, reality with hope. The explorers' perception of the land and its people became inseparable from the myth they sought to realize. The psychological effects of repeated attempts were profound. Exhaustion mingled with exhilaration, anticipation with reflection. Men would lie at night under stars, listening to the gentle lapping of water, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional distant call of a nocturnal animal. In these quiet moments, imagination took on its own momentum, spinning narratives of hidden wealth, ancient kingdoms, and cities bathed in sunlight. Dreams and waking thoughts blurred, creating a world in which the lake's serene surface mirrored not just sky and cloud, but the vast ambitions of those who sought to penetrate its depths. Every flicker of light, every shadow became a signal a guide, and a measure of possibility. Failures were common, yet they did not diminish desire. The calm, reflective water seemed almost purposeful in its refusal to give up its secrets, and in that subtle resistance, the explorers found a paradoxical encouragement. Each unsuccessful dive, each mishook, each object that slipped back into the lake reinforced a narrative that the treasure was immense, carefully hidden and worth every exertion. The line between challenge and allure blurred, creating a cycle in which the lake's serenity both frustrated and inspired. Desire persisted, patient yet insistent, echoing through every movement, every observation, and every quiet reflection at the water's edge. Over time, strategies became more elaborate. Rafts were larger, ropes stronger, and teams organized with increasing precision. Observation points were established on surrounding ridges to study the lake's movements, reflection patterns, and currents. Explorers noted changes in sunlight, weather, and wind, believing each factor could reveal clues to hidden offerings. Every detail mattered. The forest, mountains, and water became part of an intricate system of signs and symbols, guiding hands and minds alike. In this careful, deliberate approach, there was a rhythm, a slow, patient immersion into both the physical landscape and the legend it concealed. The contrast between the sacred intentions of the original Muisca rituals and the ambitious efforts of the Europeans could not be starker. For the Muisca, offerings to the lake were acts of reverence, symbolic gestures connecting the people to the sun and the divine. Gold dust and small objects were not treasure to be claimed, but reflections of faith and balance. For the explorers, these same offerings were clues, evidence, and proof of wealth. The lake became a meeting place of two worlds, where reverence and desire coexisted, and where misunderstanding fueled the slow evolution of myth. This tension, between calm devotion and restless ambition, gives the story its enduring resonance, a rhythm of intrigue balanced by quiet reflection. As the day waned, imagine the explorers at rest near the lake's edge. The surface is calm, reflecting fading light, the surrounding forest softened by shadows and mist. Poles, ropes, and rafts lie idle, the scent of damp earth and water lingering. Men sit quietly, observing, reflecting, dreaming. In these moments, the legend exists fully in imagination, shaped by anticipation, effort, and observation. It moves forward not just through action, but through reflection, desire, and the persistent human need to seek what is hidden, shimmering, and extraordinary. The lake, serene and unyielding, remains a silent partner in this narrative, holding its secrets while shaping the stories of those who approach. As the expeditions continued, a quiet rhythm developed between effort and expectation, between physical exertion and mental reflection. Each day in the highlands of South America was a slow dance of movement, observation, and anticipation. The explorers rose with the sun, its first rays cutting through the mist that clung to mountainsides and drifting across lakes like a soft veil. Their steps were deliberate, their eyes searching for the faintest glimmer of gold, every reflection and shadow interpreted as potential treasure. The forest around them seemed alive, its sounds and movements imbued with meaning, responding to the traveler's attention in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. In this environment, the mind becomes highly sensitive, attuned to patterns, possibilities, and faint signals that might otherwise go unnoticed. Progress was often frustratingly slow. Paths that seemed clear in the morning were muddied by rain by afternoon, rivers swelled unexpectedly, and steep slopes tested endurance. Yet each obstacle was met with quiet determination. Men adjusted their strategies, using ropes to navigate tricky inclines, balancing carefully along narrow ridges, and relying on one another for support. The repetitive nature of the labor, walking for hours through dense forest, climbing jagged rocks, and tracing the edges of lakes, brought a meditative quality to their movement. In these moments, physical fatigue intertwined with mental focus, and the explorers' minds floated between reality and imagination. The lake, still and reflective, remained the focal point of hope and speculation. Even when the water seemed calm and empty, the possibility of gold beneath its surface was enough to sustain effort. Rafts were pushed slowly across its mirrored surface, poles and nets probing depths where light could not reach. Every glint of sunlight on ripples became magnified in the mind's eye, a symbol of the wealth and glory that seemed just within reach. Mist rising from the water in the early morning added to the dreamlike atmosphere, creating a sense that the lake existed partially in the material world and partially in imagination. The calmness of its surface contrasted sharply with the restless determination of the man, producing a subtle tension that made every action feel simultaneously important and ephemeral. Interactions with the indigenous communities surrounding the lake were brief but significant. Villagers, often quiet and reserved, provided small pieces of guidance or warnings, though the explorers interpreted these through a lens of desire. Observations of ceremonial practices were reframed as evidence of treasure, while offerings left in the water were imagined to be signs of greater hoards. Each fragment of information, however minor, fed the narrative of El Dorado, reinforcing belief even when evidence was thin. Misunderstanding and imagination intertwined, creating a complex web of expectation, where the explorers' interpretations of reality became inseparable from their hopes. The psychological effects of repeated effort, minor successes, and near misses were profound. Fatigue blended with fascination, frustration with anticipation. Days were long, filled with labor and observation, and nights were short, often restless, consumed by dreams of cities paved with gold or shimmering lakes full of treasures. The explorer's perception of the landscape became filtered through expectation. A sunlit patch of water might hint at a hidden object. A reflection on a cliff face could be mistaken for gold. Every small success, even the recovery of a tiny fragment of ceremonial metal, reinforced the belief that vast wealth remained undiscovered. In this way, the line between myth and reality became increasingly blurred, and the legend of El Dorado took on a life of its own. Time in the Andes seemed to slow, stretching minutes into hours and hours into days. The explorers moved through forests that whisper with unseen life, crossed rivers that flowed with steady, unhurried currents, and ascended mountains that seem eternal. In this environment, awareness becomes heightened. The mind notices subtle shifts in wind, changes in light, the movement of leaves, and the reflection of clouds on still water. These observations were interpreted through the lens of legend, and the forest, river, and mountain became collaborators in a narrative of hope and imagination. Every ripple, shadow, and flicker of sunlight was significant, feeding the slow accumulation of stories that would travel far beyond the highlands. Even as small amounts of gold were recovered, the lake refused to give up its greatest treasures. Efforts intensified, strategies grew more complex, and teams became more coordinated. Rafts were reinforced, poles lengthened, and methods of searching the depths refined. The explorers' work was careful, deliberate, and meticulous, reflecting a patient obsession that could persist for days without noticeable reward. Every minor fragment of recovered metal was celebrated, analyzed, and shared, reinforcing both the effort and the myth. Each discovery, though small, seemed a promise that with persistence, the lake would yield its most extraordinary secrets. There was a quiet tension between hope and reality, a subtle rhythm that carried the story forward. The calm waters of the lake, the dense surrounding forest, and the towering mountains were constant and unchanging, while human desire pressed forward in waves of effort and anticipation. The contrast between the serene natural environment and the restless ambition of the explorers created a reflective, almost hypnotic rhythm, where time and perception intertwined. It was in this space that the legend of El Dorado became more than rumor or expectation. It became a living, immersive story, shaped by labor, imagination, and the quiet persistence of human curiosity. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, imagine the explorers pausing to rest, listening to the gentle lapping of water against rafts, the faint rustle of leaves in the forest, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. Shadows lengthen, mist curls across the lake, and the highlands exude a sense of calm and timelessness. In these quiet moments, the legend of El Dorado is no longer just a story of gold. It is a meditation on hope, desire, perseverance, and the subtle interplay between human imagination and the serene, unyielding natural world. Each failure, each minor success, each reflection on the lake's surface becomes part of a larger narrative that is both grounding and dreamlike, sustaining curiosity while allowing the mind to rest. As the expeditions pressed deeper into the Andes, the explorers' focus sharpened, and the legend of El Dorado became both a guide and a burden. Each morning began in quiet anticipation, the pale light of dawn filtering through dense forests and drifting across valleys blanketed in mist. The air was cool, damp, and fragrant with the scent of wet earth, moss, and distant blooms that had escaped notice in daylight. Men move with deliberate care, navigating slippery slopes, winding paths, and streams whose waters whispered softly as they passed. The land seemed timeless, and the explorers felt as if they had entered a space suspended between reality and imagination, a threshold where the ordinary became extraordinary. The search for gold demanded patience and meticulous observation. Canoes floated across still lakes, poles and nets probing depths invisible to the naked eye. Every ripple in the water, every shimmer of sunlight, every shadow cast on a lake bed became a potential clue, a signal to guide hands and minds alike. The explorer's imagination intertwined with reality, creating a space where myth and observation merged. A glint on the surface could be gold, or merely the sun dancing on water, yet the hope it inspired was no less real. Each minor discovery, a fragment of ceremonial metal or a fleck of gold dust, was celebrated with quiet reverence, reinforcing the narrative that somewhere beneath the lake lay unimaginable treasure. The surrounding forests and mountains added both challenge and subtle guidance. Birds called softly from hidden perches, rivers flowed in steady currents, and wind whispered to the trees. These natural rhythms created a meditative cadence to exploration, a quiet backdrop to the focused effort. Even the smallest details, a shifting cloud, the shimmer of dew on leaves, the way sunlight hit the water, were interpreted as hints or signs, adding depth to the explorer's understanding of the landscape and the legend it concealed. In this environment, every step, glance, and gesture became imbued with meaning, turning the act of exploration into a contemplative practice as much as a pursuit of wealth. Interaction with indigenous communities remained a subtle yet critical component of the expeditions. Villagers offered advice, shared limited insights into ceremonial practices, and sometimes provided tools or guidance for navigating the forest and lakes. Yet every interaction was layered with misinterpretation and filtered through the lens of desire. What was a sacred ritual of offering and reverence became, in European minds, a clue pointing toward hidden treasure. Even small items, gold dust, beads, or ritual objects, were amplified in significance, treated as fragments of a vast and hidden fortune. Each encounter deepened the explorer's conviction that persistence would ultimately be rewarded. Exhaustion, however, was a constant companion. Days stretched endlessly, filled with labor, observation, and quiet anticipation. Feet blistered, muscles ached, and minds wandered between fatigue and fervent imagination. Nights were spent in camps with the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant waterfalls, soft calls of nocturnal animals, blended with whispered dreams of cities paved with gold. In sleep and wakefulness alike, the legend of El Dorado persisted, forming a continuous thread that guided thought, action, and emotion. Even the smallest glimmer of gold, the faintest reflection on water, was enough to fuel renewed effort, reinforcing a cycle of obsession and discovery. Strategies became more sophisticated as the legend's pull strengthened. Rafts were reinforced, ropes extended, and teams organized with increasing coordination. Scouts surveyed surrounding ridges, tracking light, mist, and wind, attempting to discern hidden patterns in the lake and forest. Each small observation was cataloged, interpreted, and applied with care, creating a deliberate, almost ritualistic rhythm of exploration. The environment itself, mountains, rivers, and forests, was treated as both a canvas and collaborator, guiding movements and shaping expectations. Every ripple on the lake, every glint of sunlight, every shadow among trees became part of a complex dialogue between human ambition and natural serenity. The psychological tension between hope and reality remained constant. The lake, calm and reflective, resisted all attempts to reveal its deepest secrets, while simultaneously reinforcing the explorer's belief in the legend. Mist curling across the water in the early morning seemed to obscure not just depth but meaning, creating an ethereal quality that fed imagination. Minor successes, a fragment of ceremonial gold here, a fleck of dust there, were magnified, feeding expectation and determination. The more elusive the treasure, the greater its perceived value. In this way, failure became an integral part of the myth, as essential as discovery itself, nurturing an endless loop of curiosity, anticipation, and desire. In quiet moments, the explorers would pause by streams, lakes, or shaded clearings. The sound of the forest, the soft rustle of leaves, distant waterfalls, and occasional bird calls formed a gentle backdrop to thought and reflection. Shadows lengthened as sunlight faded, mist curled across still water, and the mountains loomed softly against the sky. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado was not merely a pursuit of wealth. It became a meditation on persistence, perception, and the delicate interplay between human imagination and the serene, unchanging natural world. Every step forward, every glance across reflective waters, every fragment of recovered metal contributed to a growing narrative that was as immersive as it was elusive. The contrast between human desire and the natural environment created a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. The calm waters of lakes, the soft sounds of rivers, the whisper of wind to the forest, and the steady rise of mountains formed a steady, grounding presence. Against this calm, human ambition surged in quiet waves, building anticipation, guiding action, and shaping narrative. The interplay between these forces, between serene environment and restless imagination, formed the essence of the El Dorado legend, a story that persisted across centuries, sustained by both reality and interpretation. By the end of each day, the explorers would sit quietly by their camps, the sky fading from gold to deep indigo. The surface of the lake mirrored the evening light. The forest softened into shadow, and distant ridges faded into mist. In this stillness, the legend of El Dorado became fully alive, not just a story of gold and treasure, but a reflection of human curiosity, perseverance, and the enduring tension between desire and serenity. Even as success remained elusive, the narrative carried forward, sustained by imagination, observation, and quiet, meditative rhythm of life in the Andes. As the explorers pressed onward, the legend of El Dorado grew heavier in their minds, almost like a tangible presence that accompanied every step through the highlands. Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks shrouded in clouds that seemed to shift slowly with the rhythm of the wind. Mist curled around ridges and valleys, softening the landscape into muted shapes, creating an environment where imagination and reality intertwined seamlessly. Each morning, pale sunlight would scatter to the forest canopy, casting dappled light on moss-covered stones, fallen leaves, and glimmering streams. To the travelers, every movement of light and shadow became a subtle signal, a hint of what might be hidden somewhere just beyond sight. The search for gold became both an obsession and a meditation. Canoes and rafts glided across lakes, their movements slow and deliberate, while poles and nets probed the depths where light could not penetrate. Every ripple of water, every glimmer of sunlight on the surface, every reflection of sky became imbued with significance. The explorers' minds were attuned to nuance, noticing slight variations in color, texture, and movement that might indicate the presence of a submerged offering. Even when nothing tangible was found, the possibility of treasure kept their attention fully engaged, transforming the act of searching into a quiet, reflective rhythm that blended labor with imagination. The surrounding forest added layers of complexity and beauty to the journey. Birds called from hidden perches, their songs gentle yet persistent, and wind rustled through leaves in a soft, almost hypnotic cadence. Streams babbled over rocks, forming subtle patterns in the water that seemed to guide steps and inspire thought. The explorer's perception of these natural details became intertwined with the legend, creating a sense that the land itself was participating in their quest. Every shadow, every flicker of sunlight, every faint movement in the distance was a potential clue, a suggestion that treasure lay just out of reach. This delicate balance of observation and interpretation created a contemplative, almost meditative state in which the legend thrived. Interactions with local communities continued to influence the narrative. Villagers offered fragments of knowledge, shared stories, and occasionally provided tools or guidance. The explorers interpreted these insights through the lens of desire, often magnifying their significance. Ceremonial objects left as offerings, gold dust sprinkled on rafts, and ritual practices became evidence of immense wealth hidden beneath the lakes and mountains. Misunderstandings added to the allure, as symbols of devotion were reframed as signs of treasure. Each encounter reinforced the explorer's conviction that persistence would yield extraordinary rewards, and the line between ritual and reality became increasingly blurred. Physical challenges remained a constant companion. Slippery slopes, winding paths, and unpredictable rivers tested endurance and patience. Rain could fall without warning, turning trails into treacherous mud, while fog obscured landmarks and disoriented even the most experienced guides. Despite these obstacles, determination persisted. fueled by hope, imagination, and the occasional minor success. Even small fragments of ceremonial gold were enough to sustain belief in the existence of greater wealth. Each setback was reframed as part of the quest, a reminder that the treasure was well hidden, immense, and worthy of effort. In this way, failure became intertwined with the myth, reinforcing rather than diminishing its allure. Psychological tension deepened as exploration continued. Long hours of labor, combined with isolation and exhaustion, heightened awareness and imagination. Every shimmer of sunlight on water, every faint reflection on a rock, and every ripple in a lake became laden with meaning. Dreams merged with waking observation, creating a narrative that was part real, part imagined. The mind filled gaps with expectation, and imagination transformed mundane details into potential evidence of treasure. In these conditions, the legend of El Dorado became a living, breathing story, sustained by anticipation, labor, and the subtle rhythms of the Andes themselves. As the sun traveled across the sky, explorers moved with deliberate care, navigating dense forests, climbing ridges, and tracing the edges of lakes. The physical exertion created a steady cadence, a rhythm in which observation, reflection, and imagination flowed together. Each small discovery, a fleck of gold dust, a fragment of ceremonial object, a glint of metal in shallow water, was celebrated quietly, reinforcing hope and sustaining persistence. Even the lake itself, calm and unyielding, seemed to participate in the rhythm, its reflective surface mirroring both the sky and the explorer's aspirations. Every ripple and every reflection became part of the dialogue between human ambition and natural serenity. Evenings brought a gentle calm over the highlands. The forest softened into shadow, mist curled over the lake, and distant ridges faded into muted silhouettes. The explorers would pause, resting by water or among trees, listening to the soft lapping of water, the rustle of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado was not just a story of gold. It was a meditation on human curiosity, perseverance, and imagination. Every failed attempt, every minor success, and every subtle observation became part of a narrative that stretched beyond time, connecting ambition, hope, and the quiet persistence of the natural world. Through these experiences, the contrast between the sacred intentions of the Muisca and the explorer's desires became increasingly clear. For the indigenous people, gold and offerings were symbols of devotion and connection to the divine, meant to remain undisturbed. For the Europeans, these same offerings were evidence of treasure, clues to wealth, and proof of the legendary city. The tension between reverence and ambition created a dynamic that shaped the story, giving it depth, complexity, and enduring resonance. The legend of El Dorado became more than myth or rumor. It became a story of human imagination, desire, and the persistent pull of mystery. The explorer's journey through the Andes had by now become a slow, deliberate rhythm, a balance of labor, observation, and quiet contemplation. Each day began with the gentle light of dawn filtering through the forest canopy, scattering across moss-covered stones and shimmering streams. Mist hung in the valleys, curling around ridges and softening the edges of mountains into muted shapes that invited both caution and imagination. Men moved carefully, stepping over roots, balancing along narrow ledges, and navigating shallow streams that gurgled softly as if whispering encouragement. The landscape was alive yet serene, and each step seemed guided as much by instinct as by maps and tools. Their obsession with gold had deepened into a meditative state. Canoes and rafts glided across lakes, poles and nets probing invisible depths where light could not reach. Every ripple, every shift in sunlight on the water, every reflection in the mist became a potential clue, a subtle signal of what might lie beneath. Even the smallest fragment of ceremonial metal recovered was treated as a significant discovery, proof of the lake's mysterious bounty. The line between reality and imagination blurred. The mind, trained by repeated observation and anticipation, began to perceive significance in the most subtle movements, creating a continuous dialogue between perception, hope, and labor. The forests themselves became characters in the story, their sounds, movements, and rhythms guiding the explorer's thoughts. Birds called softly from hidden perches, the wind whispered through the leaves, and streams meandered like silver threads across the terrain. The explorers interpreted these details through the lens of the legend, imagining patterns, signs, and pathways that might lead to treasure. Even shadows in the shifting light of the sun were read as messages, subtle suggestions that their efforts were not in vain. In this way, the natural environment became both stage and partner, shaping experience, expectation, and imagination. The psychological weight of the expedition was subtle yet persistent. Exhaustion mingled with fascination. Frustration blended with hope. Days were long, filled with meticulous labor, observation, and quiet anticipation. Nights were restless, the sound of water lapping against rafts or the rustle of leaves outside the camp blending with dreams of hidden cities, gold dust, and ceremonial treasures. Each fragment of gold, each minor success, reinforced a belief in the myth, while every failure became part of the story, evidence of the treasure's careful concealment. Imagination and reality intertwined, creating a continuous narrative that shaped perception and guided action in equal measure. Interactions with local communities continued to shape the narrative of El Dorado. Villagers offered fragments of knowledge about rituals, hidden lakes, or sacred objects, though these insights were filtered through culture and language. European explorers interpreted them as direct evidence of gold and wealth, transforming acts of devotion into clues for treasure hunting. Even small ceremonial objects became magnified in significance, each piece reinforcing the legend and sustaining human desire. Misunderstandings amplified the story, blending reverence and ambition, observation and imagination, creating a myth that grew stronger with each expedition. Physical challenges remained ever present. Slippery slopes, hidden routes, and fast-flowing rivers tested strength, endurance, and patience. Rain could turn trails into mud-laden obstacles, while fog obscured familiar landmarks and made navigation uncertain. Despite these hardships, determination persisted. Even minor recoveries of gold or fragments of ceremonial objects were enough to keep spirits high and reinforce the narrative of El Dorado. The difficulty of the journey itself seemed to validate the legend, each obstacle suggesting that the treasure was carefully hidden, precious, and worth the struggle. The lake, calm and reflective, remained central to the explorers' obsession. They studied its surface for subtle ripples, shifts in sunlight, or reflections that might hint at hidden offerings. Rafts glided slowly across the mirrored water, poles and nets probing the unseen depths. Mist often curled across the lake, softening perception and adding to the sense of mystery. Even when nothing tangible was found, the quiet rhythm of effort and reflection provided its own satisfaction. Every moment spent observing, planning, or probing became part of the ritual, reinforcing hope, imagination, and the delicate tension between human ambition and natural serenity. As days stretched into weeks, the explorers began to adopt increasingly sophisticated strategies. Teams coordinated closely, assigning scouts to monitor the surrounding mountains, mapping hidden streams, and observing sunlight patterns on the lake. Every glimmer, ripple, or shadow became part of a careful catalog of information. The environment, mountains, lakes, forests, was treated as a source of guidance, its subtle cues interpreted through experience and expectation. Even when the lake revealed nothing, the act of searching became immersive, a contemplative practice where patience, observation, and imagination merged seamlessly. The tension between human desire and the natural environment created a hypnotic rhythm. Calm lakes, whispering forests, and steady mountain ridges contrasted with restless ambition, creating an internal cycle of anticipation, reflection, and effort. This subtle interplay allowed explorers to remain engaged over long periods, turning failure into reflection and small successes into motivation. The legend of El Dorado became a living story, sustained not only by the tangible evidence of gold, but by imagination, observation, and the persistent rhythm of the natural world. Evenings offered a space for reflection and quiet contemplation. The lake mirrored the fading sunlight. The forest softened into shadow, and distant ridges disappeared into mist. Campfires glowed gently, providing warmth and a quiet focal point as explorers rested from long hours of labor. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado was more than a pursuit of material wealth. It became a meditation on human desire, persistence, and imagination. Every recovered fragment of metal, every small observation, and every fleeting reflection on the water added to a narrative that transcended individual experience, weaving together effort, myth, and the serene, unchanging beauty of the Andes. The explorers' repeated failures and small successes reinforced the myth, each attempt shaping perception, action, and imagination. The lake, mountains, and forest remained indifferent yet integral, providing both challenge and subtle guidance. Every detail, the play of light on water, the sound of distant birds, the movement of mist across valleys, was imbued with meaning, shaping a story that moved fluidly between the physical and the imagined. The legend of El Dorado persisted, a quiet, immersive rhythm of hope, observation, and persistent human curiosity, carried forward by each step, glance, and reflection in the highlands. The highlands seemed endless, a vast tapestry of ridges, valleys, and rivers that stretched into the horizon, inviting exploration while concealing secrets beneath mist and forest canopy. Each morning, explorers awoke to the gentle light of dawn filtering through the leaves, dusting the mossy ground with soft patterns of gold and green. Dew clung to every surface, reflecting a universe of tiny details that might otherwise escape notice. Streams murmured as they wound their way through the valleys, and distant waterfalls produced a soothing, continuous rhythm that accompanied each careful step along narrow trails. In this environment, the explorer's senses were heightened. Every sound, every flicker of movement, every subtle change in the light became part of a silent conversation between human effort and the natural world. As the search for El Dorado intensified, labor and imagination merged into a meditative rhythm. Canoes and rafts floated silently across lakes, poles and nets probing depths too dark to see. Each ripple of water, each glint of sunlight, each shadow on the lakebed became a potential clue, and every small discovery, a fleck of ceremonial metal, a tiny nugget of gold, or even a fragment of an offering, was celebrated as evidence of progress. These minor successes, though modest in reality, were magnified by imagination and hope, reinforcing the belief that the treasure existed and could be found with patience and careful observation. Over time, even repeated failures became part of a larger story, proof that the treasure was hidden deliberately and that the effort required to uncover it was part of the sacred journey itself. The surrounding forest played a quiet yet significant role in this unfolding narrative. Birds called softly from hidden perches, their songs punctuating the steady rhythm of exploration. Leaves rustled gently in the wind, streams whispered over rocks, and the mountains stood like silent sentinels, observing the human intrusion into their realm. Every detail of the natural world was imbued with meaning by the explorer's heightened awareness, and subtle shifts in light, shadow, or sound were interpreted as hints or signals. Even when the environment offered no tangible guidance, it framed each action, creating a serene backdrop for effort and reflection. In this way, the landscape itself became a participant in the unfolding legend of El Dorado, shaping both expectation and imagination. Interactions with local communities continued to influence perception and strategy. Villagers provided guidance about hidden paths, described ceremonies, and shared fragments of history, all of which the explorers interpreted through the lens of their obsession. Rituals intended as acts of devotion and connection with the divine were reframed as clues. Each object offered the lake transformed into proof of unimaginable wealth. Misunderstandings were magnified into myth. Partial knowledge became the basis for complex plans and renewed expeditions. These interactions reinforced the explorer's conviction that perseverance would eventually yield results, blending human desire with fragments of observed reality into a compelling narrative that guided every movement. Fatigue was ever present, but intertwined with fascination. Long hours of navigating steep slopes, dense forests, and winding rivers tested endurance, while mental effort kept perception and imagination finely tuned. Sleep came fitfully, often blending dreams of hidden cities, golden lakes, and ceremonial offerings with faint recollections of actual discoveries. In these moments, the explorers' minds were suspended between reality and imagination, creating a continuous, immersive story that carried forward their hope, determination, and curiosity. Every small glimmer of gold, every subtle reflection, and every fragment of ceremonial metal became part of a tapestry of expectation, guiding the rhythm of effort in the mountains and forests. Strategic observation became increasingly critical. Scouts were assigned to monitor ridges, watch the flow of rivers, and track patterns in sunlight, mist, and cloud cover. Each observation was carefully noted, interpreted, and incorporated into plans for probing deeper into the terrain. Rafts were reinforced, poles extended, and techniques refined to probe the lake's depths more effectively. Even when tangible discoveries were few, the process of attentive observation created a meditative focus, a rhythm that combined labor, reflection, and quiet anticipation. In this way, exploration itself became part of the legend, a practice where persistence, attention, and imagination were as valuable as the gold that might lie beneath the water. The lake remained a silent, reflective companion, its calm surface concealing both history and possibility. Mist often drifted across the water, curling and twisting in shapes that transformed perception and imagination. Shadows lengthened as the day wore on, and the interplay of light and reflection created subtle illusions that were interpreted as signs, clues, or potential discoveries. Even when nothing tangible was found, the quiet act of observation sustained effort, provided focus, and reinforced belief in the legend. Each ripple, each flicker of light, each shift of shadow became part of the ongoing narrative, connecting human ambition to the serene, unyielding natural world. The tension between human desire and natural serenity became more pronounced as the expedition continued. Calm lakes, whispering forests, and unwavering mountain ridges contrasted with persistent effort and anticipation. Failure was interpreted as evidence of careful concealment. Small successes were magnified into proof of existence. The cycle of observation, labor, imagination, and reflection created a hypnotic rhythm, blending ambition and meditation into a continuous narrative. This subtle interplay allowed the explorers to persist over long periods, even as the treasure itself remained elusive, and made each step forward part of a story larger than immediate success or failure. Evenings offered a time of quiet reflection. The lake mirrored fading light. The forest softened into shadows, and distant peaks dissolved into misty silhouettes. Campfires glowed softly, their warmth inviting contemplation after long hours of physical exertion. The explorers would sit quietly, listening to water lapping against rafts, the gentle rustle of leaves, and distant nocturnal calls. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado became more than pursuit of gold. It became a meditation on human perseverance, imagination, and the subtle tension between desire and serenity. Every recovered fragment, every subtle observation, and every reflective moment became part of the story that transcended individual effort, connecting generations of curiosity, hope, and imagination across time. The explorers' repeated efforts, minor successes, and inevitable failures wove together into a living narrative. The Andes, mountains, forests, rivers, and lakes, remain indifferent yet profoundly influential, shaping perception, guiding attention, and framing the rhythm of exploration. Each detail, the play of light on water, the movement of mist across valleys, the whisper of wind through the trees, was imbued with significance, whether interpreted correctly or filtered through desire. In this way, the legend of El Dorado persisted, sustained by both the tangible world and the human mind, a story of curiosity, patience, and enduring fascination that continues to captivate imagination to this day. As the explorers ventured further into the heart of the Andes, the landscape seemed to expand endlessly, a rolling tapestry of mountains, valleys, and dense forests that both guided and concealed. Morning light filtered through the high canopy, scattering across moss-covered stones, glinting off streams, and illuminating tiny droplets of dew that clung to leaves like fragile jewels. The mist lingered longer in the valleys now, curling in slow spirals, softening every edge and transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious shapes. Each step became a blend of careful navigation and quiet anticipation, with the explorer's senses sharpened to notice even the most subtle cues in the terrain, a change in the wind, a shift in sunlight, the ripple of water in a distant lake. The search for gold had evolved into a delicate rhythm, part labor, part meditation. Canoes and rafts floated silently across mirrored lakes, poles and nets probing the deep, still waters. Every ripple on the surface, every flicker of sunlight, and every shadow that shifted with the breeze was interpreted as a potential clue. Even the smallest fragment of metal recovered, a tiny speck of gold, a worn piece of ceremonial ornament, was celebrated as evidence that the legendary treasure was near. The explorers' minds, trained by weeks of observation and anticipation, began to perceive significance in the faintest glimmer, the subtlest reflection, or the softest shift in water. In this interplay of perception and imagination, the legend of El Dorado became as tangible as the earth beneath their feet, and every minor success or failure became part of a living narrative that guided future efforts. The forests themselves seemed to participate in the story. Birds called from hidden perches, their songs blending with the soft whisper wind through the leaves and the distant murmur of streams. Each sound was magnified in the explorer's perception, forming a subtle, immersive soundtrack to the rhythm of labor and reflection. Every movement, an animal darting across the undergrowth, a leaf falling onto a forest floor, a subtle shimmer in a stream, was imbued with potential meaning, reinforcing a heightened awareness that blurred the line between reality and expectation. Even when the forest offered no direct clue, its presence shaped the explorer's actions, framing the pace, mood, and rhythm of exploration in quiet, almost hypnotic ways. Encounters with local communities continued to add depth and context to the legend. Villagers shared stories, rituals, and advice about hidden paths and sacred sites, though much of this information was filtered through the explorer's own desires. Gold dust scattered in ceremonial offerings, small metallic ornaments, and intricate ritual practices were interpreted as signs of greater hidden wealth. Misunderstandings and assumptions magnified these fragments of knowledge, reinforcing the legend and guiding the explorer's movements. Each interaction, brief or extended, became a bridge between cultures and a thread in the intricate tapestry of expectation, imagination, and human curiosity that surrounded the search for El Dorado. Physical challenges remained a constant backdrop to the mental and emotional landscape. Slopes were steep and slippery. Rivers flowed with sudden force, and sudden downpours turned trails into mud-laden obstacles. Yet every challenge was approached with patient determination. Even minor fragments of recovered gold or ceremonial metal were enough to sustain hope, reinforcing the notion that the treasure was hidden deliberately, demanding both persistence and careful observation. The difficulty of the journey itself seemed to validate the legend. The more elusive the reward, the more meaningful it appeared. In this way, every failure became part of a narrative that intertwined with success, creating a continuous, immersive story of effort, anticipation, and discovery. The lakes continued to captivate the explorer's attention. Their mirrored surfaces reflected sky, mountains, and forest, while hiding depth and history beneath calm waters. Mist curling over the surface added a dreamlike quality, blurring reality and imagination in equal measure. Rafts glided slowly, poles and nets probed the depths, and every subtle movement on the water's surface became a potential clue. Even when no gold or offering was recovered, the quiet act of searching provided a meditative rhythm, reinforcing patience, focus, and the sustained allure of the legend. Each ripple and reflection became a metaphor for human hope. Fragile, fleeting, yet persistent, guiding effort and imagination in tandem. The explorer's psychological state was shaped as much by rhythm as by results. Days of intense labor followed by quiet moments of observation and reflection produce a meditative cadence, allowing imagination to flourish alongside disciplined action. Every shadow, glimmer, and subtle signal from the environment was imbued with significance. Even small recoveries of gold or ceremonial fragments were interpreted as signs that the treasure was within reach, reinforcing the cycle of anticipation and effort. The story of El Dorado grew in the mind with each passing day, sustained by curiosity, patience, and the intricate interplay between natural serenity and human ambition. As sunlight faded and evening approached, the landscape softened into shadow. Mist lingered over lakes and valleys, and distant peaks became muted silhouettes against the fading sky. Campfires glowed gently, and explorers would rest, listening to water lapping against rafts, the gentle rustle of leaves, and the faint calls of nocturnal creatures. In these moments of calm, the legend of El Dorado was more than a quest for gold. It became a meditation on human perseverance, curiosity, and imagination. Every observation, every minor success, and every reflective pause contributed to a narrative that transcended individual effort, weaving together desire, wonder, and the quiet, enduring rhythms of the Andes. The contrast between human ambition and the serene, unchanging environment became a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. Calm lakes, whispering forests, and towering mountains contrasted with the explorer's restless determination, creating a tension that fueled persistence. Failure reinforced hope, minor successes magnified expectation, and the cycle of effort, observation, and imagination formed a continuous story. The Andes themselves, mountains, lakes, rivers, and forests, remain indifferent yet integral, shaping perception and guiding attention while allowing the legend of El Dorado to grow. In this immersive rhythm, the explorer's pursuit became more than a search for treasure. It was a journey of patience, perception, and reflection, a meditation on human curiosity and the persistent allure of mystery. Every glimmer of gold, every subtle shadow, and every ripple on the lake became part of a larger narrative that spanned generations, cultures, and centuries. The legend of El Dorado persisted, alive in imagination, labor, and the enduring beauty of the highlands, a story that continues to captivate the mind with its blend of mystery, hope, and quiet, reflective rhythm. As the explorers ventured deeper into the highlands, the Andes stretched before them like an endless labyrinth of mountains, valleys, and forests. The morning light filtered through mist and tree canopies, casting soft, dappled patterns across moss-covered stones and sparkling streams. Each step required careful attention. Roots snaked across narrow trails, loose stones threatened footing, and hidden streams flowed quietly yet swiftly, demanding awareness and balance. The forest was alive with subtle motion. The flutter of birds, the gentle rustle of leaves, the faint murmur of distant waterfalls, all blending into a serene symphony that accompanied their careful, deliberate movement. In this environment, imagination intertwined seamlessly with observation, creating a sense that the landscape itself was alive, guiding the explorers even as it concealed its deepest secrets. The search for El Dorado had become a rhythm of effort, patience, and quiet reflection. Canoes and rafts glided across calm lakes, poles and nets probing invisible depths. Each ripple, each flicker of light on the water, each shadow in the mist became significant, a potential clue pointing toward hidden treasures. Even the smallest fragments of ceremonial metal or flecks of gold recovered were magnified in importance, proof that the legendary city's promise remained alive. Days of repeated observation, careful measurement, and subtle interpretation of the environment created a meditative pattern of labor and anticipation, where minor discoveries sustained hope and failures became part of a larger narrative rather than discouragement. The forest continued to play an intimate role in this unfolding story. Birds sang softly from hidden perches, their calls merging with the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of rivers. The explorer's senses, honed by weeks of careful observation, interpreted every subtle detail as meaningful. A ripple in a stream, a shift in light through the canopy, or a glint of metal among roots was enough to refocus attention, renewing effort and anticipation. Even the absence of signs was interpreted, carefully cataloged as a clue that the treasure lay elsewhere, reinforcing patience and the ongoing rhythm of exploration. The natural world became both partner and stage, shaping the pace, focus, and story of the expedition. Encounters with local communities continued to influence perception and imagination. Villagers shared fragments of ritual knowledge, sacred sites, and ceremonial practices, which explorers interpreted as directions to treasure. Objects offered in ceremonies, small ornaments, dusted gold, or carefully placed offerings, were reframed as evidence of the wealth that lay hidden beneath lakes or deep within the forest. Misinterpretation amplified significance, shaping strategy and expectation. Each encounter reinforced belief in the legend and deepened the explorer's sense that the secret of El Dorado was within reach, concealed deliberately, and waiting to be revealed through patient effort and careful observation. Physical challenges persisted, shaping both effort and perception. Slippery slopes, unpredictable rivers, and sudden rainfall tested endurance and focus. Trails turned to mud, streams surged, and the canopy overhead sometimes obscured landmarks. Yet even minor recoveries, specks of gold, fragments of ceremonial metal, or faint impressions in mud, sustained morale and reinforced belief in the treasure. The difficulty of the journey was interpreted as validation. The more elusive the treasure, the greater its value, and the more meaningful the effort required to discover it. Failure became integrated into the story, a necessary contrast to success that enriched the narrative rather than diminishing it. The lakes, calm and reflective, maintained a hypnotic presence throughout the explorers' days. Their mirrored surfaces hid mysteries beneath, while curling mist softened perception and added dreamlike qualities to each observation. Rafts drifted slowly, poles and nets probing depths where light could not penetrate. Every small ripple, glimmer, or shadow was examined with quiet care, interpreted as evidence or guidance. Even when tangible discoveries were absent, the act of searching provided focus, rhythm, and a sense of quiet accomplishment. Each reflection on the water became a metaphor for hope, each subtle observation a reminder of the delicate interplay between persistence and patience. Psychologically, the rhythm of labor and reflection shaped perception and imagination. Days were long and filled with careful observation and deliberate effort. Nights were quiet, often restless, spent in camp with the sounds of the forest, water lapping, leaves rustling, distant nocturnal calls, blending with dreams of gold, ceremonial offerings in hidden cities. The mind moved fluidly between expectation and observation, blending imagination with reality, creating a continuous story that guided attention, effort, and interpretation. Every minor success, every subtle discovery, and even every failure fed the legend, sustaining belief and deepening immersion. As the sun descended toward the horizon, the landscape softened into shadow. Mist lingered over valleys and lakes, and distant peaks dissolved into muted silhouettes. Campfires glowed warmly, inviting quiet reflection after long hours of movement and observation. The explorers would sit and watch the play of light on water, the gentle movement of trees, and the distant shapes of mountains fading into mist. In these moments, the legend of El Dorado transcended the search for material wealth, becoming a meditation on human curiosity, perseverance, and imagination. Every observation, every fragment of metal, and every reflective pause contributed to a narrative that connected effort, desire, and the serene beauty of the highlands. The interplay between human ambition and natural serenity created a subtle, hypnotic rhythm. Calm lakes, whispering forests, and steadfast mountains contrasted with the restless determination of the explorers, generating a cycle of hope, observation, and anticipation. Failure reinforced belief in deliberate concealment, while small successes magnified expectation. The ongoing interaction between effort and environment created a story that was immersive, meditative, and almost timeless, blending imagination and reality into a quiet, contemplative rhythm. Even as tangible treasure remained elusive, the narrative persisted, sustained by both the natural environment and human imagination. Every subtle movement, every shift in light, every reflection on water became part of a larger story that transcended individual efforts. The Andes, its mountains, forests, lakes, and rivers, remained indifferent yet influential, shaping perception, guiding attention, and framing the rhythm of exploration. The legend of El Dorado endured, alive in imagination, observation, and the quiet persistence of human curiosity. Each day, each step, each reflection on a landscape added to a story that wove together ambition, patience, and the serene beauty of the highlands. By nightfall, the explorers rested, their minds full of anticipation and quiet reflection. The sounds of the forest, the gentle lapping of water, the whisper of wind through leaves and distant animal calls, formed a gentle backdrop to thought. Even without the discovery of immense treasure, the rhythm of exploration, the interplay of observation and imagination, and the subtle beauty of the landscape sustained curiosity, reflection, and hope. The legend of El Dorado, elusive yet persistent, continued to inspire, shaping each movement, perception, and thought, and weaving a timeless story of human desire, perseverance, and the quiet majesty of the Andes. The explorer's journey through the highlands had reached a quiet, reflective stage. Mist curled through valleys, softening the shapes of distant mountains, while streams murmured over stones, their water catching the early light. Every step required attention, balancing over roots and uneven trails, listening to subtle sounds, the rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, and the soft murmur of hidden streams. Each detail seemed meaningful, part of a rhythm that blended observation, effort, and imagination. The lakes remained central to the search, their mirrored surfaces hiding depths that invited careful exploration. Rafts glided slowly across calm water, poles probing for glimpses of gold or ceremonial fragments. Even the tiniest piece recovered, a speck of metal or a fragment of ornament, was magnified in importance, proof that the legend endured. Repeated efforts, minor successes, and inevitable failures formed a meditative cycle, sustaining patience and quiet hope. The forest guided perception as much as observation. Shadows, light, and movement were interpreted as potential clues, while the natural rhythm of birdsong and water murmurs framed reflection and action. Interactions with local communities continue to shape understanding, though rituals and offerings were filtered through explorers' desire, reinforcing belief in hidden treasure. By nightfall, the forests and lakes provided calm, contemplative space. Campfires glowed softly, the mist wrapped around valleys, and distant peaks faded into muted silhouettes. Even without discovering the Golden City, the journey itself became a meditation on human curiosity, perseverance, and imagination. The Andes remained indifferent yet profoundly influential, shaping attention, sustaining hope, and preserving the rhythm of anticipation that defined the search for El Dorado. The final expeditions drew to a close, leaving the highlands unchanged yet deeply witnessed. Mist lingered over lakes and valleys, light scattered softly across stones and foliage, and streams murmured quietly as explorers moved with careful, deliberate steps. Every subtle detail, the flicker of sunlight, the ripple of water, the rustle of leaves, was observed with reverence, each moment part a quiet rhythm of anticipation and reflection. The lakes, calm and reflective, concealed depths that inspired decades of search. Rafts floated slowly, poles probing, and even the smallest fragment of gold or ceremonial metal became significant signs. Minor successes sustained hope, while repeated failures reinforced patience and quiet contemplation. Forests, mountains, and rivers guided perception, providing structure and rhythm to the explorers' efforts. As evening approached, the highlands softened into shadow. Mist lingered, peaks faded into muted silhouettes, and campfires glowed warmly, inviting meditation. The legend of El Dorado transcended material ambition, becoming a reflection on human desire, curiosity, and perseverance. Even in failure, the pursuit itself became a quiet, immersive experience, connecting imagination with the serene beauty of the Andes. The story of El Dorado endured beyond the highlands, entering collective memory and inspiring generations. Every ripple on a lake, every whispering leaf, and every subtle shadow became part of a narrative of hope, exploration, and reflection. The Andes remained indifferent yet eternal, preserving the rhythm of observation, patience, and imagination that carried the legend forward. The pursuit of gold had ended, but the immersive story, the legacy of human curiosity and quiet, enduring beauty of nature, continued to captivate hearts and minds.